Thank you very much and good afternoon. I'm Nadi Mitsopoulos and welcome to the launch of the latest report by the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre. Now I'll talk more about that report shortly, but first I'd like you to welcome Karen Jacobs, Principal of Indigenous Economic Solutions, to deliver a welcome to country. Please make her welcome.
Kaya. Oh, only some of you must have been here previously. Come on. Kaya. So for those that don't know, Kaya means hello, and it's K-A-Y-A, and it is reciprocal. So if somebody says to you Kaya, especially an Aboriginal person, just reciprocate and saying Kaya back. But I won't get you to repeat all the other words that I'm about to say. But before I do start, thank you to Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre inviting me to do the Welcome to Country today at this exciting launch. It's always a privilege, and in my capacity, not only as a principal of IES, I think I sit on about 11 boards, and one of them is that I chair a home ownership program looking at 5 different streams in home ownership. So our reasoning for that is that if somebody can afford to live in a state housing home and pay rent, you can afford a mortgage, especially under the current market rates. So Kaya Wanyan Maman Murich, Yogas Blap. Naning Jerpin Yaning Yakan Nidja. Nunik Nalang Wonkening. Nalang Mort Wajak Buja. Nalang Borlu Buja. Nunigan Jinning An Nidja Buja. Naning Mort Buja. Were Nalang Kora Mort. Nija Wajak Buja. So when I said that as a traditional owner, it always gives me a great deal of pleasure to especially stand in front of everybody and do a formal acknowledgement of my people on country, and on my country, and on the spirit of our people on this country. The region that Perth completely sits in, that most of you should know, and I should do a wave of hands, how many have done cultural awareness training? Not quite half the room, that's only about a quarter. We need to get better than that. So in Perth, like I was saying, Perth is completely encompassed by one Aboriginal country referred to as Wajak country. You will have all heard about Wajak country. However, Wajak country is split into 6 regions and 6 significant regions, and I won't go through that part of a cultural awareness process with you in bringing down right into the detail or drilling into the detail about the significance of Wajak country people and the spirit of Wajak people. But in this country, so for those that have done cultural awareness training, how many Aboriginal countries in Australia? That puts you all on notice, didn't it? There's over 375 different Aboriginal countries and over 600 different dialects. So when we talk about the diversity of Aboriginal people and why it's important to engage with the First Peoples of this country, there are some significant diversity factors and protocols that need to be adhered to when you're operating on country. If you are not an Aboriginal person, you would tend to be ignorant to the previous activities and occupations of country before there was any developmental progress. You don't know if there were ceremonies that occurred on country. You don't know if there were law programs that were delivered on country, and you don't know whether there was gender-specific programs that were delivered in a very culturally significant way on country. If you're not aware of that, often people and projects can be significantly affected by what it remains within the ground from a very cultural perspective. And that's where we come in, and it's important to engage with traditional owners and First Peoples in any of the countries that you're working on, and not consider that one country is the same as the other. It is not a one-size-fits-all. There is a significant difference in our geography and our people's customs, albeit the fundamentals are all the same when it comes to observing the governance structures within Aboriginal communities. I guess I'm evident of someone who has progressed through time and is involved. I don't feel as though that my position probably has evolved too much, being distant from what it would have been if there was not settlement. I probably still would have been an outspoken person. I still probably would have been driven and looking to benefit my people in whichever shape or form that they wish to take up. My whole mission is about providing opportunities and providing a hand up for my people, because so many Whadjuk people and so many Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people across this country were not privileged with capital wealth in order to assist them to be involved in economic development. When we look at the housing issue, how topical. I love coming to do Welcome to Countries at this program, because housing is so typical not only for the general community within Australia. Aboriginal people suffer even more. Within my business, I have over 100 people employed. 40% of those, actually 89% of that number are women, and 40% of them are not only catering for themselves, but also their children and their grandchildren, and in some cases their great-grandchildren under the roof of their home. So when we talk about Aboriginal home ownership or social housing, we really look at the opportunities that we can put in front of my people in order to better their future, but also to benefit not only them individually, but the generations still to come. And as I've just told you, some of them have got up to 3 generations living under the same roof. And that has a detrimental effect on the income earner and those that are supporting others within the family nucleus. So what I'm getting at is really economic development really does start in the home. And if we don't assist to create wealth for individuals under their own roof, we cannot expect them to go out into the community and be party to economic development elsewhere. It's one of my main roles and my main features, and I guess, you know, looking at this year's NAIDOC theme, which is keep the fire burning, and being black, being loud and being proud, I hope I'm a persona of all of those things. I do have a half Irish heritage, which I'm also very proud of, but my strongest focus is really supporting my Aboriginal people and helping them to drive their aspirations and their ambitions forward. So hopefully all of you will work with us, so please be engaging and inclusive with Aboriginal people. Understand the heritage and the uniqueness that we bring with us into projects and into planning for the future, and work with us. Bring us in, open the door, allow us a seat at the table, and we will be very clear in assisting and driving that momentum forward. Borawan, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Karen, and you keep on shouting from the rooftops. Welcome to our special guest here today, David Scaife, MLA, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Planning, Lands, Housing and Homelessness. Meredith Hammett, MLA, Member for Mirrabooka. Steve Thomas, MLC, Member for the South West Region. Senior leaders from Bankwest, Curtin University and across the WA business community. Students from Curtin University Property Course. Welcome also to the authors of today's report, Building the Dream, the Future of Western Australia's Construction Industry, Professor Alan Duncan, the Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and Dr Adam Crowe, Research Fellow at the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute at Curtin University. Now, they will talk you through the report, which explores the key challenges facing WA's construction industry. There are plenty. Can it meet the national target, the National Accord target of 25,000 new dwellings in WA every year? It's going to be tough. How does it resolve the current skills shortage and meet future needs? And how does the construction sector factor in the transition to net zero? There is a lot to talk about, and as I said, you'll get more on that report shortly. Now, I suspect most of you have a spare bedroom or two in your house. Am I right? Who's got a spare bedroom in their house? Be honest. Come on. Yeah. Come on. Don't be shy. Well, Alan's team has been counting them all. And you will pick yourself up off the floor when he tells you how many spare bedrooms there are in WA. But what it illustrates is the lack of diverse housing. and how we may all still be in love with a 4x2 brick and tile. So as I said, there's a lot in this and a lot for our expert panel to discuss, and they'll join us a little later. Now, they'll also take your questions. We'd love your questions. I always like a little bit of help. Don't mind a bit of job sharing. So if you would like to ask a question of our panel, we're going to use Slido today. So just go www.slido, so .slo.do, and I suspect most of you are familiar with it. If you just enter the code #ConstructionWA2024, and please put your questions in and I'll put them to the panel a little later. A bit of housekeeping, again, switch your mobile phone to silent. I'm sure you all know to do that. In the unlikely event of an emergency, there is a 2-tone alarm system. The first warning you'll hear, please head to the closest fire exit. The second tone will be your cue to evacuate, and just follow the instructions of the venue staff. But I'm sure we'll be pretty okay today. Let's now hear from Peter Boulas, who is the General Manager of Home Buying at Bankwest.
Thank you, Nadia, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see such a diverse group across the industry here today. Firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we're meeting today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Nadia said, my name is Peter Boulas. I'm the General Manager for Products and Digital Services at Bankwest, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre report launch, Building the Dream: The Future of West Australian Construction Industry. Thank you to Professor Alan Duncan and the team at the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre for today's event, which probably couldn't come at a more appropriate time for the industry. Bankwest has been part of the fabric of Western Australia for nearly 130 years, and we're committed to delivering simple solutions and great value for more customers and homeowners across the country. And with a focus on homeowners, today's report feels quite relevant. Earlier this year, Bankwest announced it would transition to a digital bank, a decision that enables us to accelerate our investment in delivering for our customers. For example, directly related to today's report, we recently made a policy adjustment to support the modular housing industry by providing an additional progress payment for builders to continue to remain responsive to emerging market needs. Traditionally, as is the case for most lenders, modular housing only comes with 2 payments, the deposit and upon completion. That can make builders hesitant to take on these projects, especially in an industry that is currently extremely sensitive to the impacts of supply and labour shortages on cash flow. Western Australia is currently experiencing one of its tightest housing markets, with a historically low rate of rental availability, notwithstanding the small uptick last month, and construction projects remaining unfinished after 3 years. Admittedly, the modular market is a small one, but we know that that need can drive demand, and in this heated market, Western Australians now have access to a housing option with an average construction time of 6 months. So supporting builders who can now access a third progress payment through our policy change can make that option much more appealing. We continue to watch the space, and particularly as smaller footprint homes grow in popularity, we'll look to respond to that demand. So that's just one example of the innovations we have introduced as Bankwest, with more planned for homeowners and the industry, such as secure biometric identification technology rolling out to all customers in the near future, and additional in-app home loan functionality in the pipeline, both of which will provide more control and insights in the palm of customers' hands. However, investing in solutions for our customers and stakeholders is only part of who Bankwest is, and investing in the communities in which we live and work remains a priority for Bankwest. Our partnership with Curtin University to support the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre is the centrepiece of that investment. The centre is already in its 2nd decade of producing critical social and economic insights that inform and shape debate on key issues impacting WA and the nation. During this time, it's grown to become a highly respected and nation-leading economic research centre, and today's report is another example of the insights that underpin that reputation. There are some findings we'll hear today that no doubt pose challenges for the construction industry, such as WA's inability to meet the Housing Accord target at its current rate of completion, and the shortages of construction workers being driven by poor retention. But every challenge brings opportunity, as my boss always says, such that as the need for more workers opening the door for more apprenticeships and trainees, which will offer a more secure future workforce and the search for more efficiencies in existing housing stock. These issues and others, from the stock of social housing units to housing diversity and skills profile, will require holistic solutions, which there's no one simple answer, and WA's housing crisis won't be solved by government, builders or banks alone. But what we hear today will help us steer in the direction towards solutions, and it's critical we do so for the sake of those thousands of West Australians struggling to find a home or having to accept an inadequate one, purely out of lack of alternative options. So in closing, congratulations again to today's lead authors, BCEC's Professor Alan Duncan and Dr. Adam Crowe from the Australian Housing Research Institute. I hope you enjoy your lunch, and as you take in what will no doubt be the invaluable insights that come out of the report, as well as the thoughts of some of the industry's leading minds in the panel discussion. I'd now like to welcome to the stage Mr. David Scaife, MLA, Member for Cockburn, representing the Honourable John Carey, Minister for Planning, Lands, Housing and Homelessness. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction, Peter. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on Whadjuk Budja and pay all of our respects to elders past and present. I want to thank Karen Jacobs for that welcome to country. It's, I think a moment of significance every welcome to country that we should focus on, particularly in NAIDOC week, and particularly on an occasion when we're talking about housing and construction, which is an area which, as Karen says, our Aboriginal and First Nations people face particular challenges, and I acknowledge that there is ongoing work needed to address that issue. Can I also acknowledge Professor Alan Duncan, Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and the team that contributed to this report. Building the Dream, the Future of Western Australia's Construction Industry, a topic which is one that this government, and I know much of industry and the community, are very firmly focused on. It's a pleasure to be here today representing the Honourable John Carey, Minister for Planning, Lands, Housing and Homelessness. The Minister and this government are laser focused on the issue of housing affordability. Every meeting that I attend with the Minister is focused around one overarching question. How can we get more Western Australians into affordable, safe and sustainable housing? Now that question is close to my heart. Until 18 months ago, I was a renter. My wife and I are both millennials, the generation that's on the pointy end of the housing affordability circumstances in Western Australia. We were renting in Yangebup, a suburb in my electorate of Cockburn, and we felt personally the squeeze of successive rental increases in a market that was ever tightening and which has tightened further over the last 18 months. And so for me, and I know for many members of the government, this is a personal challenge and a community challenge to deliver housing affordability for all. Of course, my generation is not the first generation to face challenges like these. Housing affordability and the macroeconomic factors that drive it have bedeviled governments for many years. And in my preparation for today, I was doing my own research, always a scary phrase for a politician to utter, but I did my own research and I came across the following statement made in the WA Parliament. And this is the statement. Where demand exceeds supply, as on the goldfields today, the position becomes deplorable, and it's there that landlords have practiced the greatest abuses. Not only have preposterous rentals been extorted from new tenants, but lessees of long standing have been forced to accept much more burdensome terms than those imposed by the original agreement of tenancy. Now, I think you can probably guess from the language used there that that's not a recent statement in the WA Parliament. That was a statement that was made by a member in September 1937. But it isn't so different from statements that we hear in the media and have heard in the media over the last few years. And I raise that example not to be glib about the issue, but to make the point that housing affordability and workforce availability are challenges that governments have successfully risen to before in the past, that we have successfully addressed. And that means we know in broad terms what it is that's required now to address these issues. We need governments that are committed to driving housing supply. We need governments that are an industry that are supporting innovation, and we need to be targeting market failures. I've had a chance to read through the report, and I was discussing it with Alan before. I can't say that I've read it cover to cover, so please no pop quizzes, Nadia, for me later on. But I have worked through it in some detail to pick out the major findings and recommendations. And in many ways, those findings and recommendations won't come as a surprise to people in this room. The report notes the need to substantially boost supply and to improve the diversity of our housing stock in a state that is still dominated by double brick detached dwellings. It notes that we have to, it endorses the government's continuing support for multi-residential developments through infrastructure subsidies and other programs. And the report recognises that our challenge in relation to the construction workforce is as much about growing that workforce as it is about making more of the workforce that we have. And I'm really pleased and encouraged in reading the report to see that the Cook government has implemented or is implementing many initiatives that are consistent with those themes. Our commitment to boosting social and affordable housing, for example, is setting records. Since the 2021-22 financial year, we have invested $3.2 billion in housing and homelessness measures. We've added more than 2,200 social homes across the state, including 913 in the last financial year alone, which is the most delivered in a financial year in over a decade. And we've placed a further 1,000 social homes under contract or construction. In terms of that challenge of housing diversity, we're unlocking lazy government land through our pilot housing diversity pipeline, with sites in Mount Lawley, East Fremantle and Busselton currently under assessment. We're supporting innovative build-to-rent projects like the 219 apartment Pier Street project in the CBD through direct investment and land tax exemptions. And we're assisting new infill multi-residential developments to get off the ground by contributing to the cost of water and electricity infrastructure through the Infrastructure Development Fund. And of course, on that key issue of our construction workforce, we want to grow that workforce, and we're making efforts to grow and make better use of that workforce, recently having successfully negotiated with the federal government to secure 10,000 skilled migration places for key occupations, including 19 in the construction industry. We've rolled out our very popular low fee and fee-free TAFE initiatives to encourage more young people into trades, and we've created a prefabrication and modular housing panels to draw on alternative building methods. And I'm pleased to say that we have 200 modular houses that are either under construction or under contract at the moment. Notwithstanding all these initiatives, one of the strengths I think of this government is that we recognise that there's always more work to do, and we're always here to listen. I heard the newly elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, refer the other day to his government as being one that will be unburdened by doctrine. And I thought that was an apt description of the current government. This is a WA government that is solutions-focused and which knows that it doesn't have a monopoly on good ideas. We want to listen to industry and to key stakeholders like the BCEC. We want to work with the people in this room and across government to deliver on the challenge that I mentioned at the outset, getting as many Western Australians as possible into affordable, safe and sustainable housing. I really thank Alan and the team at BCEC for leading the policy conversation on this significant challenge, and I'm looking forward to hearing further from our speakers, from our panellists over the course of the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you also to Peter and David. If I could be so cheeky, I might just throw stamp duty out there. Government incentives, subsidies, I'm sure that'll all come up a little bit later. We're going to take a short break so you can enjoy your lunch. And I've got a challenge for you. I don't know if you've noticed the lovely centrepiece in the middle of your table. It's the flyer for today, which actually you can build into a house. So you can follow the instructions or you can use your own creativity. I'd like to see the biggest house on the table, so I'll leave you with that for a while and I'll come around and have a look a little later. Thank you. Hello again, everybody. Please do not stop eating, but we are going to, and I hope you're enjoying your lunch and having a nice time, although I don't see a lot of construction happening at the moment. Let's now get the detail on today's report into the construction industry. Please welcome John Curtin Distinguished Professor Alan Duncan, Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and Dr Adam Crowe, Research Fellow at the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute at Curtin University. And don't forget to, please, we've got some questions coming in on Slido. Don't forget to submit those questions and I'll put them to the panel after the presentation.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you, Karen, Kaya Wanju. We acknowledge that we're on the beautiful Budjar of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders and senior knowledge holders, past, present and emerging, and extend our respects to all Indigenous peoples here today. And in this NAIDOC week, we honour the enduring strength and vitality of First Nations cultures and traditions that define Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Excellent. So Adam and I will share today's presentation of the findings from BCEC's latest report, Building the Dream. And along with our co-author, Stephen Rowley, we thank you for your interest in an issue that we regard as central to WA's economic prosperity, its social cohesion and its environmental sustainability. We know that WA's construction sector has endured pressures on a number of fronts, from COVID, through the rollercoaster of stimulus-induced demand, supply chain disruptions, loss of construction workers, and ironically, the lack of housing to accommodate precisely the construction trades workers we need to add to the state's housing supply. And yet a strong, efficient and innovative construction industry is integral to the state's economic and social progress. And the global transition and the government's aspiration to achieve net zero by 2050 is an important context that frames the conversation on the future of the state's construction industry. And as we've heard from David, the WA government has been active on a number of fronts to lift the productive capacity of the sector. But as we'll see shortly from Adam, the bar is high and the challenge is significant. So this latest Focus on Industry report from the BCEC explores these key narratives. We hope the report provides insights not just into the construction industry's own future, but into the sector's contribution to Western Australia's future economic, social and environmental landscape. Adam.
Thank you, Alan. Housing demand in Western Australia is undeniably strong, with a severe lack of housing availability for rent and purchase impacting households. This shortage is further complicated by increased population growth and shifting household needs. The ABS provides population growth scenarios for WA, both the number of people, but also the number of households. Under reasonable growth scenarios, the state's population is anticipated to exceed 3.4 million people over the next 10 years. At the same time, our population is shifting. This is shown clearly by the changing composition of families by type. For instance, the number of single-parent families has almost doubled in the last decade, and although the share of couples with children rose from 2001 to 2011, we've seen a steady decline over the past 10 years. These changes have reduced household size to an average of 2.55 people per household, down from 2.61 in 2011. Our demographic projections anticipate the state's average household size to drop below 2.5 from the start of the next decade. Shifting household sizes and their changing housing needs and preferences highlight the urgency for a greater diversity of housing options at a range of price points and locations. So, is WA on track to meet its housing need? The short answer is no. Between 2019 and 2023, there were around 14,000 new dwelling completions per year. Even the 10-year average of 19,700 annual completions falls short of our current targets. So what are our current targets? Well, the National Housing Accord indicates a need for 1.2 million new homes across Australia by 2028. This translates to around 25 new homes annually in Western Australia. However, based on the last 5 years of activity, housing completions have fallen 45% short of where they need to be. So lifting the productive capacity of the state's construction industry is absolutely critical if we're to get anywhere close to the Housing Accord targets. Alan.
So, what does WA's housing stock look like? Is it suited to meet the needs of the state's changing population? And does the way that we go about building houses in WA differ from other states? The first thing to say is yes, WA builds very differently from every other state in the country. Now this is a remarkable slide. It compares the new built wall area in WA by construction type with other states. And it's chalk and cheese, or should I say double brick and cheese, in WA compared to the rest of the country. Nearly 2/3 of the new wall area in WA is double brick, and a further 12% is single brick, totally different to other states where brick veneer, in orange here, is the dominant approach. And our floors are also entirely different to the rest of the country, mostly a concrete slab, and indeed almost entirely concrete slab. That compares to waffle pods as a dominant method for most of the rest of Australia. Now, for both walls and floors, we've heard arguments for and against different approaches and debates on which is more cost-effective, more feasible, less wasteful, or more sustainable. But one thing is for sure, WA is going its own way on this, and we need to ask why. WA builds bigger too. Nearly 45% of WA's housing stock has 4 or more bedrooms, far more than all other states. And 83% has more than 3 or more bedrooms. Now, some of this could be a legacy of WA homeowners' specific preferences, but there is also an element of inertia, with the built form following the model of what's gone before. And we've tapped into a sense from stakeholder conversations that large properties are more financially viable for property developers. But as we saw from Adam, our population is changing and demands are changing too. So we have to question whether or not this is necessarily the case now. Whatever the reason, the question is, do dwellings need to be this size? So the ABS census asks a question about the number of spare bedrooms people have in their properties, and shows that WA is well ahead on the share of dwellings with 3 or more spare bedrooms, around about 18%. And if you had to hazard a guess, how many spare bedrooms in total do you think there are in WA? This is how many. 1.4 million, astonishing. And even if you take out one spare bedroom as a guest room or a home study, that still leaves 675,000 bedrooms as vacant capacity. So the point here is that in all of the conversations around national housing targets and increasing completions, not enough has been said about how efficiently we use our existing housing stock. I find parallels with the national debate upon how we deal with skill shortages, with much of the response focused on raised migration caps and more training, but far less attention on using our existing talents more effectively. The same is true for housing, and I think we should do a better job of using our existing housing stock more efficiently than we do. Now, clearly, reducing front-loaded transactions costs from stamp duty can have an effect. Also, improving the diversity of available housing options could encourage more right-sizing among homeowners. At least we need to explore ways in which we can release the vacant housing capacity, improve the efficiency of housing stock utilisation through better matching of families to properties. And part of the problem is that the housing mix in WA doesn't seem to meet the demands or the needs of a diverse and changing population. Separate houses in WA account for more than 3/4 of the state's total dwelling stock, 880,000 houses, with semi-detached and terrace dwellings adding more than 150,000 units. So the share of separate houses in WA is 7.4 percentage points higher than for the rest of Australia. and the number of separate houses across the state actually rose by 8% between the last two censuses. Now, I am conscious that property developers respond to market demands, but consumers' preferences are conditioned by what we see or what's available. There needs to be some shift in supply away from larger detached houses towards a more diverse set of housing options at a range of price points, especially smaller and more affordable dwellings. And government incentives to drive greater housing diversity should be considered as a way to assist the construction industry to overcome the lack of financial viability of smaller properties. Adam.
So developing a workforce that is sufficient in size and skills is essential if WA is to meet its housing needs. But despite the increased demand for construction workers, WA seems to struggle to both attract and retain the workforce required. These two charts compare the size of the construction workforce in WA and the rest of Australia over time. The left-hand chart shows that WA's residential construction workforce has declined 13.5% over the past two census periods, but the workforce actually grew by 14.5% for the rest of Australia over the same period. Another defining feature of the construction workforce is the challenge of retention in the face of pull from other industry sectors. So this chart, it shows the workforce flows between WA's construction sector and other industries over the past 5 years. The red arrows show the workforce outflows from construction to other industries, and then the blue arrows show workforce inflows to the construction sector during the same period. What's significant are the outflows of construction workers to mining and manufacturing. But in addition to the skills leakage from construction to other sectors, we also see a net outflow from Western Australia to Queensland. And this does raise the question, why? Why are we losing workforce to other states? And what does this say about workforce attraction and retention policy and practice? If WA is to deliver the 25,000 homes each year needed to meet our targets, residential construction employment must increase across key trades. It's really encouraging that the WA apprentice completion rates are the highest in the country, yet the share of in-training apprenticeships, particularly for key finishing trades, is lower than the Australian average. The state government's wage subsidy scheme and financial assistance for longer-term apprenticeship programs is certainly a step in the right direction, but further support from government and industry for apprenticeship programs and on-the-job traineeships will be a critical driver of increasing the sector's productive capacity. Alan.
So the construction industry has an important role to play in reducing Australia's carbon emissions through the sustainability of its own construction processes, as well as the delivery of environmentally sustainable housing. Reducing emissions requires something of a paradigm shift across the full construction value chain, as well as over the operational life of a building. It also requires the adoption of circular economy principles in construction, including the use of low emissions or durable materials, designs that support energy-efficient living, and end-of-life materials that are reused or recycled rather than discarded. Just a note on the main sources of carbon emissions associated with the construction and use of buildings. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from a company's own energy use, company vehicles, for example, or heating appliances, industrial processes, or fugitive emissions. Scope 2 covers indirect emissions from energy purchased from external providers, either on a market or location basis. And Scope 3 covers embodied carbon within building construction materials, as well as transportation or processes. We can also look at carbon emissions over a building life cycle, from the product and construction stages through the use stage over the normal lifetime of a building, to demolition at end of life, and to recycling and reuse beyond end of life. WA's construction industry shares the responsibility to reduce the level of carbon emissions from its direct operations, but it's important to contextualise this quantum of emissions against those of other industry sectors. Over the course of a decade, the contribution of the state's construction sector to WA's total direct, or Scope 1 carbon emissions dropped to 1.9%. Now, that's a lot to do with the growth of Scope 1 emissions from mining and resources over the past decade, in teal here. But looking at the sector's per capita carbon emissions in orange, we see a relatively consistent decline over the past 2 decades. Now, we're still higher than most other states in per capita terms, and while there's still a way to go, we can see that the construction sector is getting its own house progressively in order.
As Alan has emphasised, a circular construction approach is critical to meeting not only our housing goals, but also our climate goals. International experience shows that circular construction practices have the potential to revolutionise the delivery of housing in Australia through increased efficiency and cost savings. The circular approach also leads to better workplace practices, reduced delays, and improved sustainability outcomes. Just as an example, off-site modular construction methods could play a key role in the sector's transition to net zero, offering substantial economic and environmental benefits. Yet the adoption of circular construction practices in WA is hindered by a lack of political prioritisation, sufficient standardisation, improved design guidelines, and appropriate incentives to support further uptake. Moreover, the sector's value chain is complex, involving a range of actors, often with conflicting interests. A highly skilled workforce is also necessary to transition to a low-carbon future. Given the importance of green skills training, there needs to be a greater focus on policy and funding initiatives in this area. By way of contrast, comparator countries have implemented a suite of government and industry-supported strategies that could be instructive to the West Australian context. For example, green skills programs all across Europe have facilitated a sustained increase in workers qualified in low-carbon construction practices. Greater attention is also required to how we produce and manage waste. The waste recovery rate within the WA construction sector has improved over the past 10 years. As highlighted in orange, 80% of construction waste is now recycled or reused, putting WA back on par with most other states. However, international experiences show how waste recovery could be further improved through the likes of prioritising strategic deconstruction over conventional demolition practices. Here, a change in the mindset is key, viewing existing materials as resources for future buildings where every component, so the bricks, walls, doors, window panes, all hold value. Alan.
So the report that we're releasing today contains many recommendations. On housing supply, we need to build differently and move towards a more diverse set of housing options at a range of price points, especially smaller and more affordable dwellings rather than the premium end of the market. This includes investment in alternative and circular construction methods. Reducing transactions cost and improving the diversity of available housing options can encourage more right sizing. Contracting practices need improvement to protect both consumers and builders, and the government could pilot new contracting approaches for public projects, certainly. We need at least 1,000 new social housing units each year in WA to provide shelter to those in greatest need, but also a greater diversity of affordable housing options to meet the needs of lower and middle income households. And incentives need to be considered as a way to assist the construction industry to overcome the lack of financial viability of new development projects. We need to continue with subsidised training options, retention incentives, competitive relocation packages, and hiring subsidies for new trainees. And we need a faster assessment and recognition of qualifications for overseas migrants looking for careers in the WA building industry. Completion rates for WA apprenticeships, as Adam mentioned, are amongst the best in the country, but the share of in-training apprentices lags behind other states. We regard the Construction Training Fund apprenticeship programme to demonstrably work and should be expanded. And we also need to prioritise upskilling in sustainable construction.
Property developers also have an important role to play in reducing carbon emissions through the sustainability of their own construction processes, as well as the delivery of zero carbon housing and infrastructure. But property developers and home buyers should not be left to shoulder the burden of achieving net zero. there is a need for government to provide appropriate subsidies, incentives and regulations to encourage investment in zero carbon building and waste management processes. Training the workforce in sustainable construction methods and strengthening local procurement and supply chains are also part of the solution. An efficient, equitable, well-functioning housing system is essential to West Australia's economic, social and environmental future. But the future starts now. We need to roll up our sleeves, grab a shovel, break some new policy ground to bring housing dreams to reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dr. Adam Crowe and, of course, to Professor Alan Duncan. Now, remember, if you've got a question, and thank you for those that are coming through, just put them on Slido using the event code #ConstructionWA2024. Well, let's get our panellists on stage, and please welcome Kayleen Gulich, CEO of Western Australian Treasury Corporation, Luke Parker, Founding Director of OP Properties, Michael McGowan, Executive Director of the Housing Industry Association here in WA, and Tiffany Allen, the CEO of the Construction Training Fund. Now, as I said, I will get to some of your questions on Slido in just a moment. I need a third hand. We're all good, we're all good. Thank you. But I just want to just kick off this discussion. Luke, if I can ask you, lack of diversity is a big one that came out of this report. And I just wonder why we have such an undersupply of infill dwellings. And if I think about the government pushing Metronet and TODs, and that's where there'll be high-rise and mid-rise and a lot more development and diverse development in those areas. I just wonder how realistic that is. You know, we're really going to see high-rise around High Wycombe train station, for instance.
Sure. So, a very important strategic plan document, Directions 2031, talked about a target of 47% of new housing supply across Perth and Peel being 47% of infill. Now, we've progressively been under that mark significantly for a number of years, and so this is, I guess, a long-term build in terms of the undersupply in infill areas. We're currently in a state where industry has been, I guess, aware of the coming challenges and to many extents forecasting. We're looking at about 2,500 completions of apartments this calendar year. Next calendar year drops to just under 1,000. And after that, as comes through in the report today, is 1,000 again. So we're targeting 25,000 overall. The amount of apartments in infill is a fraction. So why is that? Generally, in today's market, you're needing to sell the apartment product between 13 and 14,000 per square metre. So if you translate that to a 3-bedroom apartment, that's 100 square metres, it's 1.3, 1.4. Right, that's a lot for an apartment. So unless it's in very prime areas, you can't sell it for that. So you look at wider areas out of the prime, this means the Metronet stations, and the sale rate for built form in those areas is probably going to be 7 to maybe 10,000 square metres. So there's some time and some way to go before the current majority of infill projects, which are on hold and have been progressively switched off over the last 18 months, start to switch back on. Until that happens, we will continue to be going backwards from an infill housing point of view across Perth.
Michael McGowan, the skill shortage, is that going to be impossible to resolve?
Nothing's ever impossible, Nadia, and I think it creates an opportunity. I think we need to look at it practically, though, and at the moment we need a supply of talented, skilled labour that can come into the state and make an instant impact. And I think that's why when we look at the 10,000 skilled migrant visas that were talked about last week, 3,000 of those going to trades to come in to make an instant impact is really important. But I do think, and Alan touched on it, the work that's been done by the Construction Training Fund in bringing profile to not just the construction sector, but the wider trade base as a career option has been really important, and we've seen an uptick in those commencements over the last few years. And if we can maintain those retention rates, then we'll start to press ahead. But I think if you're looking at the here and now, it's a challenge.
Well, just on that then, Tiffany Allen, notice in the report that everyone goes to Queensland. what's going on? What is it about Queensland that's attracting so many people? But again, give us an insight other than the mining industry, why people are leaving, where they're going, and is that a disincentive to actually invest in training up these people if they're going to leave?
I don't think it's a disincentive. We've got to continue to train our workforce no matter where they go, because they might come back. So we just, there's always that inflow and outflow of people in the state. Queensland had a really good campaign. I don't know if anyone saw it when they were over there, Tradie in Paradise, where they're paying $1,500 to land in the state, another $1,500 if you lasted 6 months. That's attractive. They do have a massive pipeline of work to meet the demand for the Olympics, so it's $10 billion worth of projects just with the Olympics alone, let alone Queensland really trying to lead the nation in terms of energy transformation projects. But fundamentally, they pay more for their trades. So the trade price rate in Queensland is one of the highest in Australia. New South Wales and Victoria are starting to edge up because they're trying to compete for the same workforce. So, unless we do look at what people are getting paid in the trades, we will struggle. And then we've got to compete with the resource sector as well on top of that. But Queensland's got a lot going for it and have been promoting pretty heavily, but they've got a very big pipeline of work as well that they need to meet, and they're no different to us.
I think what's important as well to kind of pair with the report is that our construction activity went from, particularly in the residential housing space, from 30,000 homes being built in 2016 down to 10,000 in 2019, 2020. So, what we can't let happen again as a state is have these peaks and troughs in fluctuations of building activity, because it becomes unsustainable for trades and for people to stay within our industry or even the state, because they have to go elsewhere to be able to find work.
Well, I might get you then to pick up, Kayleen, because then that comes down to investment and how much.
Any
figure? Give us
any figure. I think just it's a real mix. Where do you get your investment from? So I think there's a role, going to a conversation I had with Peter earlier from Bankwest around the banking industry and how they invest in large-scale investments, how they do risk projects as part of their financing products. There's the view of how the banking industry views sustainability in investment and in development, and can they actually see through the upfront costs of sustainable development to change how they invest in those projects to actually support them and de-risk them up front. And then there's the type of models of how we actually provide mortgages to individuals, to cohorts of individuals. If we're talking about using our existing housing stock differently, can you have co-ownership models? Can you change up what you're actually doing in the traditional one person buys a house with a mortgage and repays that over time? And then there's the role of the government sector, and there's a lot in the report around that in terms of how that's continues to support project development, do the work up front, so you've got the land release and development and reducing costs that is responsible of government. But there's only so much money to go around, and so how you spread that becomes a question between individual house owners, industry and construction, and then government as well.
I'm going to get to some of the questions on Slido, but I need to get this one off my chest. Stamp duty, is that still the biggest impediment?
Look, it's certainly the case that front-loaded transactions costs through stamp duty do create a barrier to sort of flow, to transition between properties. We shouldn't forget the importance of revenues from stamp duty to state finances. We know it's $2.5 billion, so you can't switch that off. It would be catastrophic to the WA government's finance. Therefore, and we know that there are alternative options that are, from an economic perspective and from a distortion perspective, more efficient. Of course, the sort of standard alternative is land tax, but you can't go from stamp duty to land tax without a very extensive, sort of phasing out and phasing in process. But we've certainly heard, I think, from a lot of the conversations we've had with various stakeholders that it necessarily creates a barrier. You've got stamp duty, you've got the deposit that needs to be secured for a new property, and so even if the stock was there, then it does create a barrier.
There was a question from the floor about, some of the other states looking at making this an annual tax. Is that something you'd support?
I think we're supportive of a review on it. I think you've got South Australia looking at different elements of it and taking it away from first-time buyers. Queensland are looking at it pretty closely at the moment. And even if you can use it as levers, I guess, to promote downsizing in particular areas, you don't have to necessarily perform wide-scale reform, but looking at areas that are going to trigger, movement and create flexibility within the housing environment is definitely something the state should be looking at.
I'll just add to that, and Alan's research got 1.4 million spare bedrooms, 675 second spare bedrooms. This is huge capacity. Why aren't people, some people are very happy, but a portion of that is right sizing. I think there's limited options and the barriers to transfer, and there's a number of MPs, and I think 2 tables from State Treasury today, so be careful what I say, because stamp duty is a significant income source. But looking at other options, where is there the option to give people the choice of a broader-based approach to recover a similar amount of revenue over time, but also taking into account what other streams of revenue, such as GST and utility costs and other taxes and the like, does the government across the board pick up every time there's a transfer? So you're not just freeing up a house to right size, there's also other income streams that come about the result of that transaction taking place. And I just, that broader based approach, it would be significant. And when there's more targeted programs that might look at one-off stamp duty reductions for, there's already ones in place for first home buyers, but it's probably a bit more politically unpopular, but for moving into retirement, is there a one-off that could apply that's particularly targeted at assisting people approaching retirement that want to move to away from the family home because they're moving into retirement? That would make a significant contribution to that transaction cost, and that coupled with the more availability of infill, you're starting to free up a clogged housing market.
Not to speak to the Treasury tables, but a slightly different view on stamp duty. I think an annualised upfront cost versus an ongoing, or an upfront cost versus an annualised cost. When we talk housing sustainability, particularly for low-income households who we want to encourage into the social housing and into the affordable housing, to add another equivalent of the local government rate annually to their cost structure becomes a real barrier. And so thinking through what you replace stamp duty with, so you've got that revenue base to support initiatives like in the report of government support for industry and development diversification. There's a real balance there, and again, that's why other jurisdictions are looking to have it moved aggressively down that path. It's really difficult to replace. Sure. And devil's advocate, we talk a lot about stamp duty, but the cost of transferring a house and flipping a house, we don't talk about the real estate costs, the buy-in and the buy-out costs of real estate agents. That's a significant cost stack. So maybe we should be having conversations more broadly around the cost barriers.
What are you suggesting?
I'm not sure if real estate agents in the group.
Doesn't matter.
I'm just saying there's commercial costs. So there's building costs, there's government costs, there's commercial costs, and individual households make calls on that. So it's all part of the story in terms of turning a house over.
Okay, let's get to some questions from the floor. This one, prefab and modular construction is popular in Europe and Japan. How can prefab and modular contribute to housing supply, and what support does it need in WA? That's open to anyone.
I think the first thing it needs is a stable, strong housing market. So I think if we're going to ask commercial businesses to invest in whether it's new technology, new methodology, modular type housing, then there needs to be security that we're not going to have the peaks and troughs that we've seen over the last 20 years. And to do that, we need to, I guess, come out as a state government and say this is what the plan looks like and this is how we're going to bring this to market. I guess I'm a big fan as well is you can't be what you can't see. So we need to, whether it's the prefab market, whether it's the modular market or even the high-rise and medium density markets, we need to be able to facilitate more of it so that people can get their head around it and it can become more mainstream.
And look, I think there's a really big role for research and development to continue to improve off-site modular processes, so that the cost comparison between off-site and modular and the more orthodox or traditional built form, as well as this cost comparison between explicitly sustainable built form, they become closer. And so I think there's a massive role for research and development, both within industry and in the university sector.
Yeah, also just adding to the workforce perspective on that, modular housing and off-site construction is actually easier to attract a workforce, particularly for a more gender-balanced workforce. So currently our female trades is 2.5% and total female workforce in construction is 16%. Off-site modular construction is more attractive to the female market. It's a safer environment to work in, and they're generally quicker builds as well. So, you're getting really good production rates from modular construction. So from a workforce perspective, going more modular is actually going to improve the productivity of our housing market.
I'll just add to that. I think there's a funding piece at I guess an apartment at scale can definitely work with apartments. Whether it's aged care where you've got a bit more scale and repetition. But chatting with Peter from Bankwest earlier, they're looking at have made changes to make the third progress payment off-site at a residential level. I think at a commercial project level, one of the barriers to that at scale is that banks often won't fund what's not on-site and what's fixed on-site. And so if 40% of your project is coming from over east or offshore, it can't be funded. So that in itself, I think, is an area, if there was some improvement there, there's certainly an appetite. There is efficiencies. It's I think loosening up how you actually are able to pay for it during construction, because that's projects we're working on. There is interest there, but that's a real barrier, and often means that it's whether you want to or not, you can't, because the funding is a bit constrained.
I think we do have a question from the floor, and we do have a couple of roving mics. Hasib, I believe, is from Curtin. He's a property student. Where are you, Hasib? Stand up and tell us what is your question.
Hello, my name is Hasib. I'm from Curtin. And my question was, from your experience, what are the key challenges and opportunities in integrating sustainability into property development projects? That was my question.
Sustainability?
Yes.
Just repeat your question. We just struggled to hear you.
From your experience, what are the key challenges and opportunities in integrating sustainability into property development projects?
Key challenges.
Upfront cost. So if it looks like sustainability innovation adds to the upfront cost, it's very hard to build it into household constructions.
Yeah, I agree
it's
with that.
As simple as that.
That's a big one. I mean, buyers are increasingly wanting it and desiring it, but cost pressures are very real. And are they willing to pay more for it? We're starting to see a little bit of that, but not at scale. So that, I think, is a barrier to that technology take-up. It's also a fine balance. I mean, there's been a couple of changes now as National Construction Code, which tightens up the sustainability. So things which is very important, we have to move in that direction. But you're adding, 3 to 6 to 9% to the cost of construction each time, which in itself impacts housing supply.
Okay, so does that mean there needs to be some sort of subsidies or some sort of incentives? And also, sure, David Scaife is taking notes. But is that the answer here?
I think subsidies or incentivising sustainable development is definitely the way forward. I think from an
do you know how you could best do that? What would be?
I think it's in that upfront cost piece. So working with it's probably from a consumer point of view, because I think if you default to the building industry, I think they're after what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years, they're going to default back to what they've always known and what has worked and what's been consistent. So I think the consumer is much more educated in what they want from their house. And it won't necessarily be with every builder, but there'll be opportunities for this to grow in a market if it's driven by consumer demand.
And look, for those that have studied economics in the room, this is a classic case of a market failure based upon sort of individual economic agents not taking account of the social good, the social benefit of, say, a sustainable built form. And we talk about this a little bit in the report. We have ambitions to create a fluid and affordable housing market. We also have ambitions to achieve net zero by 2050, but to impose all of the costs from within the built form on the property developer and the consumer of our trajectory and our journey towards net zero is going to be a stretch, because individuals won't be, they're not able really to value the full social contribution of that sustainable sort of built form purchase. And so when you have a market failure, there's a classic case for some form of intervention to make good that shortfall of the private value and the social value of a transaction.
Yeah. I think that market failure will close reasonably quickly going forward for a couple of reasons. I think our large-scale industry is pushing towards sustainability in their own construction projects and their own project delivery, and that's going to drive innovation and research into technologies that will be adaptable to the household level. I think our top end of the market starting to demand it because they understand both their own emissions footprint and what they want for sustainable living, and that will then support innovation directly into housing products. And I think the industry more broadly supporting sustainability in terms of what the Waste Authority is doing, what's happening with the construction and recycling, the C&D, is creating the ecosystem that will enable us to move down this path. So I think it's coming, and I think it will get to a point where the price point is not as large as it is now, but it is still there at the moment, which is that barrier.
Yeah, I think there's such a backlog in the system in the private sector capacity-wise. You're taking someone away from traditional trade to training something new. I think there's what's more important, and I think there's a lot the private sector can do, but generally buyers want this, and so developers are generally trying to be progressive in this space. I think equally there's a lot at a government level that can be done. Things around the utility suppliers and assessment of power networks and timeliness of approvals, and a bit more of an openness to something that might not be business as usual. I think would go a long way to giving private sector a bit more confidence to be progressive if there was a bit more, I guess, collectively from all parties on that front.
So a related question, this one, are rigid planning, design and environmental standards inhibiting the ability of the private sector to deliver affordable housing?
I think there's more and more challenges being faced by builders to deliver housing, and you've mentioned some of them there, but there is I think, we've got some quite large volume builders. I'm talking more in the detached space in Western Australia, but a large portion of our homes are built by small to medium enterprises, and we've seen the costs of doing business rise significantly over the last couple of years, and the more we keep demanding of those smaller businesses and the harder we keep making it to be able to produce homes, the more
but
people
improving the standard is not a bad thing. I mean, we don't want those dormitory suburbs anymore, and I won't name suburbs, but I'm sure you know which ones I'm talking about, where they're tiny blocks, they're black roofs, they all look the same and there's not a tree in sight.
I think you're right.
We don't want that anymore, do we?
No, absolutely. And I think there's things that improve the standard of living, but we have to be careful about everything that we're imposing on that industry.
Okay, thank you. This question, in regional WA, this is from Kitty, thank you. In regional WA, most apprentices travel to Perth for their theory. How do we remove this barrier so we can increase the take-up of local apprenticeships? Question.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. And we recognise that. The board actually travels to the regions twice a year, and we hear on the ground exactly those barriers, training in the regions, and which is why in this budget that we've put forward a travel and accommodation allowance for those that are travelling. And that's not just travelling to Perth, that might be travelling from Halls Creek to Broome to do their training, and that we recognise that there's an impost on doing that to get to the right facility to do that training. So not everywhere can train in plumbing. So in Kalgoorlie, there's no plumbing that's done in Kalgoorlie, you have to travel to Perth. but in other areas where there is carpentry or there's bricklaying. So not every trade can be covered in every region, so we recognise that it is an impost on businesses to let their apprentices go, but it's also the cost for those apprentices, which is why we now have the travel and accommodation allowance to help cover some of that cost when they are travelling. And that's not just for the period of their course, it's the travel days that are accounted for as well. But certainly what we're feeling here in Perth is exemplified in the regions. You think we've got it hard here with housing, you go to the regions, it's much, much worse. And it's a huge barrier for being able to attract people, but also retain our skills in the regions as well. So we do need to work on those incentives.
You touched on this, Alan, but anyone can pick up on this one from Ryan from Curtin. Is the high percentage of detached brick and tile dwellings built in WA due to a lack of alternative options, or is it West Australians' preferred dwelling type?
Look, so the members of the panel will have far more insight than I. I simply, reflect on the, the evidence in the report. It's just a remarkable difference in the size of our properties, how our properties are built in WA compared with other jurisdictions. There are some, I'm sure there are some technical reasons, there are some reasons to do with efficiency. There does seem to be a sense of inertia to a degree because it has always been thus.
Because we always built bricks here in WA and there was a very good marketing campaign. And I'm being honest though, I mean, it was a good sell, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you look underneath the pros and cons of different construction methods, double brick has been sort of badged as, thermally sort of modulating. So in sort of very hot or very cold times, it's a sort of better, it's a better product than some alternatives. But again, I don't know whether or not innovation and alternative forms of construction might be closing that gap. But to the point that we were making, preferences are informed by what you see. You can't form a preference about something that's not there. And so I think diversity begets, a greater, set of choices available to people, and that can potentially loosen up, I think, the market.
So to the panel, will that change with generations, do you think, that attitude or that desire to have a big house?
I think people want it now. If you're in your 20s or you're moving to retirement, do you want a 4-bedroom house? I think people want choice. I think, again, the Planning Commission, developing Directions 2031 8 years ago, identified this. We need more housing choice. We're severely lacking. 76%, Alan's report, is detached housing across Perth, which is significantly higher other comparable states. People want it. It's a case of it's not being developed, so it's not an option for people to choose. So I think it's one about the undersupply of particularly infill that is driving that outcome, and not a case that people don't want it or choose it. As we know, when you look at projects, One Subiaco Grove, Beaumaris Beach, a lot of the locals opposed those developments. Once they're built, they all moved in because they want to stay in the suburbs and they want to have that choice. So, to me, in the market, across the portfolio, across the office, it's one of lack of choice and just the significant undersupply of particularly infill over the last period of time that is causing that outcome rather than people not wanting to choose those options.
Michael, you look like you want to say something.
And I think looking back pre-COVID, it was incredibly affordable and we were looking at house and land packages that were under $300,000 and I think what we have seen is we've seen a step change in that affordability challenge and I think now when you look at some of those house and land packages that are probably up around the $600,000 entry level, we will see first home buyers and people stepping into the market having to consider other options as to kind of how they do that. And as we see those transport nodes and start to see some of that high and medium rise development around some of those Metronet stations, I think people will start considering that as their entry level into the market and then transitioning out of there.
But they're not going to be in the outer suburbs, are they?
No.
Not until there's house price growth, similar to what we've seen in the last 12 months. So support Damien Collins' forecast, we're looking at 20-30% house price growth. At that point, we'll start to see infill construction switch back on. Challenge for us in this room is how do we bring policy solutions collectively to not cause such significant high price growth, because that, of course, just hits fundamentally at housing affordability.
David Scaife's still taking notes.
And to avoid our response to housing affordability, which is to extend the development front with greenfields at the end of the freeways. So we need to come up with policy solutions around infill, around different policy types, different housing types and different products, not just additional 3x2s or 4x2s on the edge of the urban sprawl.
Okay. Now, a couple of other questions. Should the government support investment in reskilling the construction workforce to adapt new innovative construction technologies like 3D printing?
So interesting, because we were thinking the same thing and commissioned a research piece with Curtin Future of Work Institute to actually understand what are the trades that we're going to need in 10, 15 years' time and how different are they? Do we need a different type of carpenter or a different type of electrician? And where in fact the research showed, no, it's actually training the current workforce in transforming into new ways of delivering housing, which is no different to when a new product comes online and you just learn a different way of doing a facade or a different way of doing roofing. So it's not that we need to design new qualifications, it's actually training the current workforce in new product. But when the new product comes, it's up to, we need the builders to actually take up that product so that that training can come. The Construction Training Fund does have a supplementary skills program, so we fund up to the 80% of the cost of any of those ongoing training for the current workforce to make sure that we are moving. That can be in work health and safety, that could be in new products, that could be in working at heights or confined spaces. It's what those skills are needed for the current workforce to continue to grow their skills and also to deliver the new types of housing that we need for the future.
Okay, I've clearly hit a nerve in the room, but that's okay, we're all friends. This question, which is more palatable, dormitory suburbs or broad-scale homelessness? I'm sure one competing with 40 other groups for a rental would take a dorm over nothing.
It's a values conversation. What's more important? What are we choosing as a community, as a collective government of different levers we're pulling? What's more important? Is it higher sustainability outcomes, which are really important? Is it better building design outcomes with our design review panels? Or is it really getting back to the core, which is housing supply? I think depending on where you're at in your place of work and within the housing ownership rental cycle, you have a different view. But we can't solve all the problems. I think we just need increasing focus on what we think are the most important. To the floor, is anyone here not think we're in a housing crisis in Perth at the moment? Okay, well, one. Sure, but do you not think we're in a housing crisis? Okay, so besides one, so we got through much bigger challenges during COVID. There were short, sharp policy, private sector moves that got us through. And I think that's going to be a big part of where we're at. We're deep in this now. We need long-term solutions around training, around technology and investment, but we got to double our efforts with the here and now to quite quickly try and turn the dial on commencements to kickstart things if we're really in any way think that we can achieve the 125,000 per annum by 2029 and the overlap with our sustainable targets, which is so significantly influenced by where housing is located and that diversity of stock.
Look, I think it's a really important question. And as so often is the case, the answer is not easy to give. I don't think it's an either-or question. And I think what it also does do is it highlights the challenges of governments in prioritising policy making, because it's not a question of you prioritise so one imperative over another. We have to travel to net zero. We have to do something about the environment. We have to do something about affordable housing options. We have to do something about homelessness. There are so many imperatives, not all of which point in the same direction in terms of policy solutions. So this is where the complexity in the challenge and the problem comes, and where the complexity and the solutions come. So, you know, to deliver on all fronts needs a whole bunch of different things happening at the same time. The commitment to social housing investment is really important, but that needs to continue. It's really gratifying to see that we're approaching 1,000 new units over the last financial year. We need to do the same this financial year, next financial year, the year after. By creating more social housing, you start to potentially loosen up the market if there are, at the same time, affordable options for people to transition through the housing continuum into supported accommodation and private market accommodation where rental costs are lower than they are now. So there are a whole range of issues, and then we talk about how to add a layer of sustainability onto the top of that. Because of at least the initial challenges of that cost difference, I don't think we can get there without some sort of government support. But as prices become more comparable, then I think we're going to get there. But I think it's really just highlighting the challenges of policymaking against these multiple objectives.
Will we see more build to rent?
There's significant investment interest. There's been positive policies at a state level, which has been encouraging the build-to-rent funds. At a national level, there's attempts at the federal legislation or policy direction. At the moment, it's a bit off and potentially counterproductive, but there's ongoing discussions at federal level around interest there. We would certainly expect it. There's been a lot more student accommodation. There's multiple build-to-rent apartment towers that are approved, ready to go. They will have to be redesigned because under the new construction codes and then reapproved through planning approvals because they were approved a few years ago. That's not a challenge in itself, but there is strong fund interest in build to rent from the private sector and increasing conversations with government around the lazy lands and how can government, private sector collaborate, which I think is a very positive thing and should be encouraged. And the quicker the assessment and decision-making process in there, the better, to assist that private capital to not get sucked up elsewhere or distracted by something else. But from, again, from an advisory office point of view, there's very strong interest. It's more lack of builders, tier 1, tier 2, to build.
Those tier 2 builders, the ones that we've lost over the last couple of years, aren't they?
It's pretty much across the board. Yes, there's been a number of that tier 2 apartment space that have withdrawn from the market or gone bust. Michael will talk more about the residential housing market, but of course there's the regular number of insolvencies there that we seem to keep appearing. And then generally in the tier 1 construction space, there isn't build to sell apartment projects isn't always the first preference because there are less complicated, more certain projects such as build to sell, so build to rent, but really government projects, high schools, industrial projects, which if they come in a bit over budget, you can't know they're going to keep going. Whereas an apartment project would just have to go on hold.
Okay, so then on that point, this question, making the point that apartments are a key part of supply and that only luxury apartments are coming out of the ground. So how can the government help incentivise more supply, more apartment supply? Michael?
Well, I think there's probably a 10% gap is the general kind of feedback around making those apartments feasible and making them able to stack up. So, I think they've started with the Infrastructure Development Fund as an option to be able to get those moving. But I do think, that it's going to be a hard decision for government that they have to find a way to get in there and bridge the gap. Otherwise, we're just going to rely on the natural market to take its course, and we're going to have to wait for those house prices to grow over the course of the next 12 to 18 months before they stack up and then they become feasible.
This one from C. It has become impossible for young West Australians to buy a house without support from parents. How do we fix this growing intergenerational inequality? Wait for the inheritance?
Wow, that's the New South Wales and Victoria solution. So I think this is an example where
Just explain what's happening
Well, our housing, our affordable housing is obviously shifting in the last 12 to 18 months with the increase of the average house price. But up until 3 or 4 years ago, we were very much the lowest in the country. It was something we promoted as being a very affordable jurisdiction to come to. It was affordable to acquire a house in terms of the deposit required, the interest rate environment was supportive, and the average house price was supportive. So what we're finding in the last period is that's shifted. The interest rate environment is less supportive. The average house price has gone up 37% in 18 months and predicted to go higher again. So what we're starting to see is a 15-year later situation than what we've seen in New South Wales and Victoria. And in fairness, I don't think they've solved for that. That intergenerational cost and the intergenerational access to housing hasn't been solved nationally. So where we can look to other jurisdictions to see how it's done, where we can look to the banking sector, but I think the default solution is a way for equity to grow up in a house and for parents to be able to afford to share that with their children. Which is
We either reduce population, which is probably not going to be politically palatable, increase supply. We've got to increase supply. This is what all the research points to. Industry, Tanner UAA, Nicola Property Council, other stakeholders, we've got to increase supply. To Michael's previous comments around state government, there's probably fair to say there's probably some less constructive policy announcements across 22, 23, but last 12 months there has been a series of far more positive, much more engagement, and some really good policies coming out around the infrastructure fund, which helps get apartments off the ground and going. There's been updates to Key Start scaled to help first home buyers get into the market, which is a really positive thing. There's ongoing planning reform, which is a very dry subject, but critical to supply across the board, particularly out of Minister Carey's office, which is important to be tackled, and he's doing that. And I think this is within our capacity. We can increase supply. If we don't have to just let house prices grow another 30%.
But is it a chicken and egg? So you said earlier we need to increase the value of units to get them out of the ground. But if we're increasing the value of units, we're reducing affordability.
100%. So reduce the cost to build an apartment or a house or infill or a villa. This is within our ability. We have the dials. We overcame much larger challenges during COVID. We can peel back the layers of cost which have caused this increase and the position we are now in. And if we can do that, then more supply can commence sooner, which will reduce price growth in the forward trajectory. I think at the moment, a lot of work is being done. More, quite obviously, needs to be done from Alan's research and from just how significantly short of the infill and housing generally targets we are. If we can shift this dial. If we do that, then we don't have to lose out on affordability. But on the current trajectory, we are and we will.
Question about, did you want to say something? Oh, you're good. Question about migration, because it's often blamed for housing issues, but also migration is unquestionably part of the solution. So who can provide some balance and courage for solutions and stop blames? I mean, where is the balance? Because it's part of the problem, part of the solution. Who's brave enough to take that one on?
I think in the initial instance now, there needs to be some targeted attraction, and I think we've partnered with Department of Training and Workforce Development around a construction visa skills program that's been active over the course of the last 12 months. And small to medium businesses and even some of our volume builders are getting their heads around that migration piece, which is traditionally not something that they've delved into. But I think there's 300 workers now that are on the ground, which is, we need far more than that, but it's a start, and I think the investment that's been put into it, it'd be kind of one of the best returns on investment if we can continue to unlock these pockets around the world to attract skilled migration and help us develop those.
It's a tricky one, but we've got to get on with it. If we dig ourselves out of this hole from how much we're going backwards each year, we need more supply. So it's not great because skilled migrants have to live somewhere. Talk to your across the housing portfolio. Talk to your aged care providers that have, say, dormant aged care facilities that can be short-term accommodations. Look at the 5,000 skilled workers that come in and say, right, of the X amount for construction, limit visa criteria so they can only do 80% of their hours on residential construction to stop the bleeding out to other sectors, which we see a lot of. We got to tackle this thing unless we want to reduce population, which I think is a bit unpopular. Yep. So I get it, but we got to get over the concern of it and get on with it.
I'm just not sure where the skill migration is coming from. The whole world is in a synchronised uplift of activity that is all racing to similar challenges we've got. So housing affordability, housing access, supply and demand imbalance is an international problem. And so how to attract the workforce to Australia in the first instance and how to attract them to Western Australia, let alone the residential construction property market, I think is the challenge. So what is our value proposition? And part of it used to be affordable housing, which is, as we've talked about now, diminishing.
Yep.
So where are they coming from?
Sure, but if you impose a cap of $2,200 for the last financial year, they cannot come in. They're not allowed. So at least offer the opportunity. And I think there are barriers for that, but I think the announcements, if it comes through on the ground, the 10,000, I think through different ways, it allows the opportunity for those workers, which at least we're allowing that rather than a hard cap of 2,200, which is, of course, just way off where it needs to be.
Alan?
Look, I mean, I haven't enjoyed some elements of the conversation around, the link between migration and housing shortage. We've done some work specifically on migration, and it is the case that in Western Australia, the net inflow of skilled migrants has been of substantial benefit to Western Australian economy. It has not crowded out jobs. It has not crowded out housing. I'm also not enjoying the climate around international students and some of the challenges and restrictions in those accessing courses that they've signed up for, because today's student is tomorrow's skilled worker in WA.
And then just to add to that, and often get asked, how do you feel about migration policies, given that the training fund is here to train our own, grow our own, but you've got to have a balance. And in fact, skilled migrants coming in actually are the people that are employing an apprentice and training the apprentice. So it needs to be that balance. We need to grow our own and we need a flow of others to be able to maintain the whole workforce. So we need to work together to do that. And we are not going to have enough people in this state or in this country to deliver the pipeline. So we are going to rely on a workforce that's coming in from other countries. And recently I was just in London talking to our WA government office, where we're looking at actually getting skills recognised in country rather than waiting for them to get here and then get recognised, actually doing it in the country of origin, which is a huge step forward, that they can come in and just start working rather than having to wait a couple of months before they can. So there is some good work that's going on.
Thank you. I'm going to have to leave it there because we have run out of time. Thank you so much for your questions. There were so many more, and I'm sorry I couldn't get through them all, but you can always give me a call and talk about it on the radio. You know the number, because I can tell you we'll be talking about this for some time. Can you please thank our panel again, Kayleen Gulich, Luke Parker, Michael McGowan and Tiffany Allen. Now, before we wrap up, and thank you again so much, it's been a really fantastic couple of hours, but before we wrap up, I'd like to invite Professor Lindy Fitzgerald, Interim Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at Curtin University, to deliver a vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Nadia. What an interesting and challenging and engaging discussion and conversation we've had today. We have all agreed here as a room that we are in the midst of a housing crisis. But isn't it reassuring that as we navigate our way through these issues, there are experts in our midst who are doing the necessary research to reveal the interconnected web of economic challenges and advocate for the change we need to ensure West Australians can access the right kind of housing at the right price in the right place. Professor Alan Duncan, well done, and thank you to you and your team at the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and to Dr Adam Crowe and Ahuri for another fantastic report that highlights just how complex this problem is, from a lack of housing choices to labour shortages to unsustainable building practices, and puts forward a raft of clear, considered recommendations for improvement. From what we've heard today, maybe the biggest challenge we face is changing the prevailing mindset about what good construction is. As a proud Western Australian myself, I just assumed that double brick houses were better. I assumed that a concrete slab was necessary, and I thought a waffle pod was a dessert. So there's a community engagement piece here. We have to ensure the issues we've covered today are understood by the general public. I think if we can raise awareness that there are different ways to build that are more efficient, more affordable, and just plain better, that will be every bit as impactful as changes to policy and funding. Fortunately, Alan and his colleagues at BCEC and Ahuri are no strangers to the media, and I know there will be considerable media interest in the findings of this report, given how important an issue it is for so many people in WA. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers today, Karen Jacobs for a welcome to country, Peter Boulis and David Scaife for your opening addresses, thank you, Dr Alan Crowe, Professor Alan Duncan, and our panellists, Kayleen Gulich, Luke Parker, Michael McGowan and Tiffany Allen. It's a privilege to have had you join us here today and offer your considerable insights. And our MC, Nadia Mitsopoulos, thank you very much. You've done a great job keeping us on track. My colleagues at BCEC tell me they love working with you because you make their lives so easy, and I can certainly see how that's the case. Finally, I want to thank everyone at the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre who helped with the planning and delivery of today's launch. BCEC has been a flagship research centre at Curtin since 2012, and its work has always had the wellbeing of the WA community at heart. Besides housing research, BCEC investigates employment levels, gender and diversity in the workforce, health and wellbeing, and many other areas. Their partnership with Ahuri has been producing impactful research on the health of the housing market for more than a decade. Given the quality of their output and the fact that housing will likely remain the #1 issue in our state for quite some time, I'm sure the Ahuri partnership will only continue to strengthen. Once again, thanks to everyone who made this event possible, and thank you to everyone for coming today and participating in this very timely conversation. And now I'll hand back to Nadia to close the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Professor Lindy Fitzgerald. Thank you all for coming today. Just a reminder to use the QR code on the flyer to download a copy of the report. Please have a read. As I said, we've got a lot of discussion to go on this. And may I also suggest that you leave via table 14 and have a look at that marvellous construction. I don't know who is responsible for that, but I'd like to live in a building like that. Fantastic. I could see that on St George's Terrace. Well done. They were certainly lived up to the task. Thank you for having me. It's been a great afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.